Oh, banged the camera there. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're back. All's good. So I'm going to do a set of videos here on, I guess, what we'll call something like history, theory, technique of IQ testing, because as we get more in depth into the more extensive literature on IQ, and of course its social implications, we should have a foundation for what it is that we're talking. What's the foundational claims, or what's the foundation upon which these claims are being based, whatever they happen to be that we'll talk about, right? So let's spend a little time understanding IQ testing. So though the acknowledgement of the existence of something like intelligence, general intelligence, has been, this literature going back to the ancients has been aware of the existence of this. It seems as though the first person who set out, at least from what I've been able to determine, the first person who actually set out to try and quantify or measure this or get some kind of handle on it in an empirical way was Francis Galton, who's a pretty interesting guy. If you don't know anything about him, he's worth looking up. I can just barely skim his interestingness here. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and shared in that family's tendency towards unusual genius. And in fact, Galton actually wrote a book on genius as part of his interest in all of this. And so, yeah, he set out to try and come up with tests, measures that could assess a person's intelligence. He's also interesting, parenthetically, he's interesting to this discussion in that he developed a lot of the important techniques that are used in even today, even though they had some refinements along the way since him, in the study and measure of intelligence, IQ. For instance, something that I'm not going to talk about it in length here. I'm going to dedicate a video to it down the road. The idea of standard deviations within a Bell or Gaussian curve it's become sort of a standard technique for talking about intelligence, and he was the fellow who came up with this. He also coined a whole bunch of the language that we use now, which is quite surprising. I believe, I don't have it in I have notes here, but I don't think I have this in my notes, but I'm pretty sure he actually came up with the term genetic and eugenics. And he also coined the phrase nature versus nurture. So right from the start, Galton was sort of plugged into what was going to be sort of the hot topics that would arise out of all this. And he made a whole range of really remarkable contributions to a wide range of fields. But like I said, we won't spend time on that here. But it's Galton's pretty interesting. Francis Galton, pretty interesting guy to look up if you want to find out about a brilliant mind who's had tremendous impact. His legacy has had a tremendous impact, but really doesn't get the attention that he deserves in general, I think. So yeah, Galton came up with these ideas, but it turned out that the tests that he developed weren't very effective. Now, they were valuable, in the sense that they sort of pointed the direction for the kind of thing that was possible in terms of recognizing and studying and quantifying IQ or intelligence. But his contributions in terms of the practical tests didn't turn out to be that effective. It was actually a fellow named Alfred Binet, I think, in 1905, who first came up with what we could call a valid and practical IQ test. He was actually commissioned by, I believe, the French government or a government in France to do this, and for the specific purpose of identifying what we might today call children at risk. Children who are going to be especially challenged in being able to learn the basic curriculum of the educational system for the purpose of helping the children. It was kind of ironic that, considering the accusations that are made about people who are interested in intelligence, all being, evil Nazi eugenicists, and eugenicists in the Nazi sense of the word. We'll talk about that later too. That it all began out of this, this mission of trying to help disadvantaged children. Is kind of ironic. So anyway, he comes up with a much more effective task. He incorporates some of the stuff that Galton had been using, things like memory span, being able to remember list of digits, these kind of things Galton used. But he integrated a whole lot of other techniques, a lot of other kinds of challenges, tests, challenging cognitive abilities. And I may actually dedicate a whole brief video just to talking about the specifics of his tests and the kinds of things he did. They're quite interesting. You might be quite surprised to see some of the things that he came up with. But then it was a fellow we mentioned in the last video, Charles Spearman, who in some ways was even more, at least at a conceptual level, more the groundbreaker in terms of thinking about IQ tests. And we mentioned him in the last video as being the person who identified the G factor, right? So when he turned to the work of Galton, and obviously Binet took account of Galton because he included some of his tests, but I don't think he dealt with them so much at a theoretical level, whereas that Spearman very much did. Wasn't enough to simply have test challenges within the test that were sufficient. Was also understanding more the sort of theoretical foundation for what fell short in Galton and how future IQ testing could be improved. And so one of the things he hit upon was this idea of reliability, which is actually sort of a technical term used in the discipline, but it means pretty much what it sounds like it means. I mean, can you rely upon the findings of this test to provide accurate measurement of an individual's IQ or intelligence, right? So what he hit upon was the idea that the low reliability was a function of insufficient sample size, and this idea of having sufficient sample size has become a classic postulate, or a postulate of classic test theory. And it's quite common now for us to talk about sample sizes. So people do it like I'm a baseball fan, and baseball people are always talking about sample size, right? And I don't know how many people who use this term understand what they're actually referring to. I know that I've often used it with a vague sense. I understand that to get an accurate result, you've got to have sufficient enough numbers, the data points mixed in, so that somehow you wash out the error or something, right? And you sort of in a vague sense, I understood that. But where it actually came from is kind of interesting. So I thought maybe I'd just spend a few minutes on that here. So what Spearman hit upon was this idea that there was always going to be error. So you have a test. You do a test, call it X or whatever, right? Within X, you have two dimensions, right? So you have T, which is the true score, right? The true score is the objective fact of the individual's intelligence. But in every single test, there's going to be some error that can come from a wide range of things, from how the individual's feeling that day, if they had a good night's sleep the night before, or test conditions poor in some way, some optimals or background noise, or all kinds of things contribute to error, so that prevent you from getting to T, the true score, that objective empirical fact of what the person's IQ is, right? So his idea then was that error was a random outcome, right? It's going to use different degrees of errors and different kinds of errors in any particular test situation, right? So in any case of X, yes, you got T, and yes, you've got E, which is for error, but the error is, can't be anticipated. I mean, of course, if it were, if you could anticipate it, you could eliminate it, right? But it's because it's random, you can't anticipate it. So since you're always going to have error, and since it's always random, and it can go, therefore, in either direction, that is, error can give a higher score than is objectively true, a score higher than actual T, or an error can give a score that's lower than actual T. So you can have a situation then where you're going to have this line down the middle, which we'll call T, the true score, and you have a series of different errors on either side, right? Errors that exaggerate the score and underestimate the score, let's say. Overestimate and underestimate because of the contribution of the error. But the idea was that if you could think of them in quantifiable terms, like so many points removed from T in a positive or negative direction, you can have the errors will start canceling each other out. So in this example, which I'm showing you, which I hope I'm showing you, which I'm intending to be showing you, I have here just 8 data points, and magically they work out like to an error of 10 in each direction, right? Well, that's in 8 data points, you're probably not going to have it wash out perfectly, right? But this is the idea of it, though, right? The more tests you do, that is, the more data points you have in your analysis, or in your sample size for your analysis, the more different kinds of error you generate, the more likely it is that you're going to provide a sufficient number of a different array of kind of errors on both the negative and positive side of the T line of the true score, that they're going to cancel each other out in terms of the final score of from all the different tests in the sample size, all the different errors within all those tests are going to wash each other out if you have enough. Now, if you just have a couple, you can have quite dramatic differences, right? I mean, you could have, an error of 10 on the positive side. You had 2 sample points, right? You could have an error of 10 on the positive side and 2 on the negative side. Well, that's not washing out at all, right? But the more you have, considering the random distribution, eventually they'll self-cancel. So this was the idea of having sufficient enough sample size to be able to generate a data set that will allow you to have a reliable finding in the end. So this was a pretty important contribution from Charles Spearman. Another important contribution was the development of what's called factor analysis. So I'm not going to try and do that here. My time's already going by here. Anyway, so it wouldn't be time to do it even if I wanted to. But no, I'm going to have to really bone up for this. So I'll have to tell you, like I'm a mathophobe. I'm a genuine mathophobe. I'm the kind of guy. I'm reading a book and it's text and I'm going along and having a great time reading, and then I come to a bunch of mathematical formulas, right? And my eyes just glaze over and okay, like I'm lost, right? Searching the page, then I find the text starts again. Oh, okay, we're back in the book. Okay, good, right? So I don't know what it is. But the funny thing is, here's the funny thing we're talking about, because heredity and intelligence and all this is going to be part of what we're talking about here. Interestingly, my father was a math guy. My father was actually an accountant. My brother is a math guy, not professionally, but he's like really good at numbers. And my son is a super math guy. So it's kind of weird, right? Like I'm surrounded by this sort of genetic circle of math wizardry, and yet somehow I didn't get that gene or whatever it is, right? It's very strange. Yeah, maybe I just had a traumatic experience in some math class somewhere, and it was so traumatic that in fact I've suppressed the memory and don't even remember that it happened. Or, I don't know why, but just the math's a challenge for me. But I'm going to, for you guys, for this video series, I'm going to do my best to try and understand factor analysis, and I will be, as part of this little set on history, theory, technique of IQ testing, I will try to do a video on factor analysis and see if I can make sense. Maybe I might even solicit someone to help me with it. But I will do my best to produce a video on that. So just the last few closing remarks on Spearman here. He's often given credit for, and this is part of the whole sort of differential psychology, sort of London School of Psychology tradition, which is often thought to have begun with Galton, actually. So Spearman in particular, and that tradition in general, has often thought to be sort of the corrective to what at the time was called faculty psychology. So the idea of faculty psychology was that we had all these different sets of faculties. So, perception, conception, judgment, reason, memory, wisdom, imagination, all these different things were just thought of like sort of as discrete faculties somehow that we possessed. And it was because of this kind of faculty thinking that the idea of the G factor that we talked about in the last video came as being so counterintuitive to so many people, right? So with Spearman, with the techniques of Galton and Binet, with the more systematized theorizing of Spearman, it was thought that this London school had now saved us from, that's not the right way of putting it, had overcome the conceptual failings of faculty psychology, recognizing that in fact there was this G factor and that went across all these different domains, the different, we talked about in the last video, the different, forget the terms I use, sort of bundles of abilities, right? But I'm not sure if that's necessarily true. And particularly from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, which maybe not in all its forms, but in its most famous form, most prevalent form, the Santa Barbara school associated to Cosmetes and Toobies, tends to think about the human mind precisely in these sort of what they would call modular ways. So I say faculty psychology in some ways is still alive and well in evolutionary psychology, but there does seem to be a conflict, right, between and both of them have, strong empirical cases, right? Evolutionary psychology, the sort of modular mind version, has strong empirical case to be made for it, but at the same time, as I'm talking about in this series, so does the G factor, the idea of a general intelligence, seem to have a strong case, empirical case to be made for it, and on the face of it, as I say here, on the face of it, it appears, as it appeared at the time that Spearman and the London School was disproving or challenging or discrediting faculty psychology, that still remains something of a conflict even now here in the beginning, early going of the 21st century. But I'm not sure that it's as much of a conflict as it first appears. So I'm going to make a video about that too. And I think I mentioned this earlier. But either as part of this little set on IQ testing, but probably not. Probably right after it, I'll do a video on reconciling this apparent conflict between the more in the business they call domain specific form of psychology, of evolutionary psychology, and the more domain general idea of the G factor. You do a video on trying to reconcile that. So coming up in this little set, history, theory, technique, I will do that G factor thing, though maybe not next. We'll look at some of the actual IQ tests themselves, Sorry, something weird happened there. I think I'm back now. Look at the actual IQ tests themselves, and I know there's something else I wanted to say I was going to do. I can't remember what it was now. Binet, looking at Binet's work as well as modern tests. So that's it, I think. It's a beautiful morning here. It's like about 8 in the morning here, and I don't know. The sun hasn't quite come up, but it's beautiful and peaceful. All right, so I think that's it. All the usual stuff. Please share, subscribe, like, all as appropriate. Please leave your comments below. I'd love to hear from you, and I think that's it for now.